Hello, everyone. This is Chris Morris, the Director of Faith Formation here at Holy Family Catholic Church. Um, and welcome to episode 10 of season number 8 of our Elevate Talk series. I'm recording this session a couple of weeks after we actually did these talks live. We always like to have a recorded version of the talks. Normally we do them before the talks, but been very busy. So we're going to record the last two sessions, episode 9 and 10. After the talks occurred. I'm very excited about this talk, How the Sexual Revolution Objectify Women, Turn Men into Boys, and Undermine Our Economy. Very long title. For those of you that are unfamiliar with our Elevate Talk series, our parishioners submit possible talk topics, and then parishioners vote on those talk topics. And we generally take the top 8 to 10 to give in any given season. And that's what we did here. This is the last of the 10 talks we're giving in season 8. The 9th, which goes very well with this, a wonderful pairing, so to speak, was a talk on the theology of the body that our youth minister, Alan Santa Isabel, gave. And it was a wonderful talk, a great lead into this talk. And we'll be posting his recording as well shortly if you want to see that. It's a really good summary of St. John Paul II's theology of the body in about 50 minutes, which is not easy to do. So please feel free to look for that and watch that as well. But this talk was a great follow-on to that, really built off of what Alan presented and leveraged a great deal of his information to talk about what has happened over the last 60, 70 years or so that have indeed led to a greater objectification of women, has indeed turned men into boys in many ways, prevented men from developing into the men they were supposed to be, and is now undermining not just our economy here in the United States, but is doing damage to the worldwide economy. And to see how all this ties together, hopefully you'll recognize those ties pretty quickly and realize how painful a period we are moving into. So with that, let us, with that very uplifting intro, let us begin in prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Lord, thank you as always for this opportunity to understand more about our faith, and in this case, how our faith and our culture are intertwined, and what it means that we have gone down the path we've gone, which certainly is not a path that you wanted us to go down, but what it means for us and what it can mean for us to turn this around. And we ask that you give us the grace to understand these connections, give us the grace to stay steadfast in our faith, to share that faith with others, and hopefully help the world around us see the mistakes that have been made, and correct those mistakes and return to the path that you intended us to be on. And we ask this in your holy name. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, so we're going to hit a number of questions. So we're going to start just by making sure we're all clear on what the sexual revolution is and the various waves of that revolution and what they've met. We're going to talk about pre-revolution norms and attitudes. And here I'm really specific to pre-wave 3 sexual revolution norms and attitudes, what the enablers then were of the sexual revolution, at least wave 3, which is really our focus, the ultimate drivers, winners, and losers in this process. Then we're going to take a little side detour for a moment to talk about Humana Vitae, Pope St. Paul VI, historic landmark document on contraception, which, by the way, was his last official papal writing, despite the fact that his papacy went on for another, I believe, 8 years after the fact. So you can definitely see that this was a landmark document and had many effects, not just on the world, but on him, that we can talk about. We're going to talk about the impact that the sexual revolution, the third wave, has had on women, men, and families, how that's translated into an economic impact that is being felt world over. And then I'm just going to ask the question at the end, and I can tell you, when we asked this live in the live session, it was unanimous concurrence that yes, the sexual revolution has objectified women, turned men into boys, and undermined our economy. So again, what is the sexual revolution? We're really talking about the third wave of the sexual revolution here. And I just want to pause for a moment. I hear some odd noise outside, so I'm going to pause just for. Sorry about that. There was just someone banging some things around outside our office, and it was going to come through on the recording, so I wanted to put an end to that. So we're really talking about the third wave of the sexual revolution. The first wave in the early 1900s was really focused on women's suffrage. The second wave was really more focused on, extending women's rights and the definition of women's equality in the workforce and in the public square. The third wave that hit really starting in the late 50s and into the 1970s was more of a sexual revolution focused on sexual equality, or at least the idea of sexual equality, so that women could explore their sexuality with the same sense of freedom that most perceived men exploring it with. So, and I think, I'm using very specific words here. I think there was a lot of misconceptions, misunderstandings, and this is a perfect example of you have to be careful what you ask for, because, there was a significant shift, a shift in social and moral norms, really with and driven by to a large extent, although there are many influences by the women's liberation movement, that was geared towards putting men and women on equal sexual footing. And again, primarily in Western world, started in the late 50s, lived through the 70s. And it challenged everything. It advocated sexual liberation and pleasure as a right for all. And once you advocate for that right, it gets extended to a very large group of all. Okay, so, it isn't just women. Now it's for children and for anyone that's breathing. Okay, and again, it was driven by a mix of things. The women's liberation movement was a key player, but there were cultural changes that happened to be happening at the same time, scientific advancements that actually became enablers, and then political activism. And quite frankly, there have been past periods where there's been this drive for sexual freedom in the history of humanity, multiple. And I'm going to highlight a few of them. But they always lasted a very brief period of time because, people saw the damage that could be done. In this case, the conditions were right to mask a lot of that damage for an extended period of time. And hence, this sexual revolution not only took off, but gained momentum and has now become so entrenched in Western society that there are some questions about whether some of the damage that has been done can ever be reversed. Clearly it can, okay, but there's always those fears now. Can it be reversed? And can we actually, go back to the earlier period? And the answer there is probably no, we can't go back, but we can move forward maybe to a better period and maybe to a better understanding and learn from some of the mistakes. But, the sexual revolution, again, we're really going to focus on that third wave of feminism that helped trigger the revolution, starting in the late 50s into the 70s. And again, I'm not degrading the feminist movement. It did wonderful things, not just for women, but for humanity in those first two waves, and went a long way to really waking people up to the dignity of humanity, both in the male and female form. And so wonderful things. This third wave that occurred obviously brought with it some problems. So I don't want to disparage the first two waves, which ultimately laid the ground for the civil rights movement and a greater understanding of human dignity across the planet. But this third wave actually did some damage that will take us some time to recover from. And we're going to be living with this damage, and it will more likely get worse before it gets better, probably for another several decades before we're able to address it. Okay. So I think you get my opinion on this. right from the first slide. So what was happening in the world as we moved into the late 1950s? So after World War II, strangely enough, we kind of reverted back to a very rigid form of gender role. So clear identification of what women do versus men do. Men are out there, slaying the beast, earning the dollars. Women are taking care of the home and children, right? And so, that nuclear family model was idealized. And we saw it in every aspect of our lives, including media. Think of shows like Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver. And, media was actually enhancing this idealized version of the nuclear family. And everyone thought that this is what you had to do. And part of that was male dominance in society. Again, not just through media, but media really did reinforce that as well through television and theater. And there was just so much movies that dominated our cultural understanding. And again, between these, gender norms, this idealized thought of the nuclear family, which just may fit for many, but doesn't fit for all. Okay. And this male dominance in society was quite problematic. So, we also had on top of that, very conservative sexual views, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But what it led to was sex as a taboo. You don't talk about it. You don't have conversations about it in public discourse. And quite frankly, that's unfortunate. It's created by God for our good. There's a reason he created it, and it's a beautiful reason. So the fact that we really weren't exploring it as a topic in light of God's revelation was problematic. And, it led to this whole stigma around premarital sex, which, by the way, is not a good thing. All right. So there should be a stigma. But the idea was it led to people treating others with a great deal of disrespect and anger, for something that certainly, while it may be immoral behavior, was driven by human desire, driven by human instincts, animal-based human instincts. And the stigma that was applied to people was extreme. So you had a period of extreme conservatism. You had people, looking down on others who were suffering from the same desires and thoughts they were suffering from. You had the media reinforcing this male-female role model tied around the nuclear family. And if it was outside of those constraints, it wasn't something that was to be accepted. So again, part of what supported all this certainly was religious teaching, as it should have. Okay, however, it was religious teaching maybe taken to an extreme that wasn't really actually fully aligned with religious teaching and the equal dignity between the sexes, and the complementarity. Certainly, we have different roles and different strengths and different weaknesses, but I think people took this to an extreme and may have been problematic and led to some of the backlash. So again, pre-revolution, you had that. You also had a legal framework, especially here in the United States, but not just here. There are other countries that did this. There's other countries that still do this, but criminalizing certain sexual behaviors. So it's one thing to talk about, a moral deviation and the breaking of a moral law. It's another thing to turn that moral law into a civil law and punish people for sin. Obviously, certain sins, you murder someone, that there's going to need to be some punishment there. But there are others that perhaps that's taking much too far of an extreme, and then is also contributing to giving people the freedom to then ostracize and take the law into their own hands for people that are suffering from some of these sexual desires. So we had some problems there. That combination of religious conservatism and the legal structure that was built around some of these breaks in moral law was certainly contributed to that overall conservative approach, the the taboo nature of talk of any sexuality whatsoever, and then the persecution of people that were living lives outside of what would be considered the norm of sexual behavior, or living in a state of sexual sin. So, that's kind of where we were as we enter into the end of the 50s and the early 60s. What happened? So first off, the traditional power structures and hierarchies, whether it be governmental, religious, social institutions, for a century before this, had been part of the backbone of the United States, or of the Western world, which includes the United States. And certainly there was a great deal of trust put into these large institutions. And as we kind of exited the 50s and into the 60s, that trust started to deteriorate. We started to actually, as we television, radio, news expanded, we started to actually see things for the first time that maybe had been, I'm not going to say deliberately hidden, but weren't fully exposed to the Western public. And now they are being, exposed, and people, in many cases, rightly so, are starting to challenge these institutions and, push back on what were, obvious deviations from their mission, or where there was corruption involved. And while the wars, World War II was certainly a war you could look at and justify on a number of fronts. All of a sudden we have the war in Vietnam, and we have the Cold War, and it's getting more and more difficult for us to put our trust in the government. We're struggling on a number of fronts. A number of the promises, both governmental, religious, institutional, are not coming forward or being met. So you started having activists push back on these traditional power structures. At the same time, science is advancing, and especially science, some of the mental sciences, the psychological sciences. We're starting to get more detailed studies on human behavior, and specifically human sexual behavior, through figures like Kinsey and Masters and Johnson. Those sexual norms are challenged, really, with data supporting that, hey, there's a much larger number of people than who cared to admit that they're engaged in a wide variety of sexual behaviors. So as these publications started to come out, and these surveys started coming out, and these studies started coming out, what you started to realize was, for the first time, people were being made aware that there's the majority may be engaged in things that most people would have thought, I must be the only one. And all of a sudden now they're saying, wait a second, this is actually pretty widespread, and is perhaps the norm, and not the deviant behavior that I had started to convince myself it was, or my religious background convinced myself it was, or the legal situation convinced me that it was. So you have people pushing back against power structures. You have this research being released that's opening people's eyes to a series of thoughts and behaviors that perhaps were hidden from most before. And then you blossom into the anti-war movement, which championed a great cause, which is, let's put an end to this war, let's put an end to needless killing, but at the same time also championed free love and permissive and formal attitudes towards sexuality on all levels. And now you have this link between sexual freedom in air quotes, and the ending of a war that was very difficult to justify, and the end of institutional corruption. So you had these good things that people wanted that were now tied to a loosening or elimination of any sense of restriction on sexual behavior. And by combining those things, or linking those things together, it was much easier for people to go down that path of liberal sexual behavior, because it was tied to other good things. Okay, yeah, I am anti-war, I am anti-corruption, so I should be all for sexual freedom. So once that link was created, it was very difficult to break it. media jumped right on board with that. So whether it be books, films, television, all of a sudden what you started seeing in media, where before, again, back to the Fathers Know Bets and Leave It to Beaver and television shows where your nuclear family, traditional structures, very conservative behaviors, sex is a taboo. All of a sudden, all bets are off, and again, it was across all forms of media and art in general. It was encouraging that open dialogue on sexuality. It became a almost a game in a way to see how far you could push the limit through the media. And each year, that limit got pushed a little bit farther, a little bit farther. We've continued to see that to our day today, which naturally did bring on a good thing. It did, result in the decriminalization of a lot of sexual behaviors, which actually prevents a lot of violence and discrimination that was associated with the criminalization. So not all these things were bad. I mean, again, you want to criminalize behavior that is truly evil. But as Nietzsche said, you got to be careful, because I like to use Nietzsche. I always like to use a nihilist. Nietzsche pointed out that if we continued to criminalize religious deviants, we'd still be burning heretics, right? So we know that's not right. So again, breaking down some of this criminalization of sexual behaviors was a good thing. You can't force people into moral patterns through law. Okay. You have to actually show people the benefit to them of good moral behavior and the freedom that comes with it, and the alignment with God's plan. But you can't force it, because all that does is push people into hiding. It pushes people into spaces that we should not be pushing people, that we then can't help them. So the decriminalization was good. Unfortunately, it may have gone a little bit too far, because we went from criminalizing certain sexual activities to actually loosening our thinking process on this entirely, till it got to be the point where the key word was consent. And so that as long as people could consent, okay, it must be good. All right. So two consenting adults, that was the huge phrase as I was growing up in the 70s and into the 80s. And that gave us a little bit of a safety net, because we always put two consenting adults, saying, hey, look, it's not possible for children to offer this level of consent. Yet now, as we're into the 2020s, you're notice that we don't actually talk about consenting adults anymore. We talk about consenting parties. And we're actually getting to the point where we're talking about educating children in sexual behavior, because we're starting to say, yeah, they can give consent to this. And this is where that slippery slope starts going too far. So we went from decriminalization, which was good, to a focus on consenting adults, to a focus on just consent. And at some point, even consent starts to break down, where consent, the definition of it, gets wider and wider and wider. So that's the path that we are on at the moment. And then, finally, but maybe one of the biggest crushing blows was the reform of divorce laws, which again intended to be a good thing, primarily for women who were often stuck in a relationship that was abusive, whether it be physically or emotionally or spiritually or what have you, with no easy way out, or no plausible way out. And so the reform in the divorce laws, no fault divorce, again, part of it was, really driven with the intention of giving women a protection. But what it resulted in, especially no fault divorce, no fault for divorce, no fault divorce, it had a profound effect on people's views on relationship permanence and the value of marriage. Okay. And that's a problem. Okay. Now we are actually striking at the foundation of the nuclear family, where before it was being idealized. Now we're starting to break it down, almost to the point, and where we are today, where the nuclear family is no longer the ideal. It's actually something that in many realms is looked down upon as a negative. And quite frankly, if you look through human history, it has always been the nuclear family which has been the backbone of every civilization. And when that starts breaking down, so does that civilization. So we really need to take a good look at our historical references here, because we're heading down a path now that could mean the end of the civilization that we've been living in for really the last couple of thousand years since the Roman Empire. Additional enablers certainly were, that it's actually, it says second wave, really should say third wave of feminism in the 60s and 70s, really looking at sexual liberation as part of their independence equality, trying to put, the idea is, men are very sexually free and have no adverse effects. So let's allow women to have this same sexual freedom. And unfortunately, it was naive to think that there were no adverse effects for men. And now compounding that problem for women is actually going to cause more and more of a disaster. And we're going to see that played out, as we move forward. The birth control pill, that was the hinge. Okay. So that gave women that ability to pursue copious and commitment-free intercourse, as men have enjoyed forever, right? This is the thinking. And that this is the missing ingredient. This was the thing that allowed the sexual revolution not just to promulgate, but to last as long as it has. Again, the late Roman Empire, you go back to Georgian Britain, the Roaring Twenties here in the United States, those were great examples of prior sexual revolutions that burned out within a decade or two. And the reason they burned out was, the result of intense sexual activity is usually a lot of children born to people that do not want them. Okay. Well, all of a sudden now you have the birth control bill, which can change that. Okay, changes that equation, and the deterrent is no longer there. Combined with then abortion on demand, which was like a double safety net, which legalizing the murder of innocent human beings in the womb really was the crushing blow, because now you actually have taken away all sense of responsibility and all sense of accountability. And again, this safety net, and I call it a safety net, it is for the parent, certainly isn't for the child. It is a murder field for the child. Is combined with the pill, or just two things coming at the same time, which enabled this sexual revolution not to last for 1 decade or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. We're now in our 7th progressive decade, and with each decade we've gotten more and more permissive, more and more deviant from where we started. So again, these were the things that combined together to really bring us to where we are today. So the drivers, again, I gave you a number of drivers, but that second wave, really third wave feminism, created the willing partners, freed women from the idea of chastity and the burdens of motherhood. Again, I'm going to put that in air quotes. Chemical contraception minimized the risk, and abortion on demand eliminated accountability. All right, so I gave you a number of things, but those 3 things, the feminist movement moving into the equality on the sexual front, and the combination of chemical contraception, which again minimized the risk associated with sexual permissivity, and then abortion on demand, which was the ultimate, again, safety net for parents, certainly a killing field for children, eliminate accountability completely. So those were the big ones. The winners, who won from all this? Well, men. Okay, so this is the oddity of all of this. Again, feminists were trying to pursue equality for women, and again, the initial feminist waves, whether it be the right to vote or then working equality, what have you, these are all wonderful things. But when we went down this path, it was actually exactly what men wanted. Okay, they wanted commitment-free sexual intercourse on demand. without having to be viewed as or serve as providers. Okay, and that's exactly what they got. All right. There's a great story. You talk about the relationship between Hugh Hefner and Marilyn Monroe, and Hugh Hefner had bought the pictures that Marilyn Monroe had taken out of desperation, nudes that she had taken with an independent photographer who paid her basically nothing for them. 6 years before Hefner bought them and then published them in Playboy magazine. So he was able to do that without her permission because he bought the rights from the photographer who had bought the rights from her. And this plagued her for the rest of her career. As a matter of fact, he would republish them annually, which was incredibly cruel. He had a sort of a fascination with her. And strangely enough, when she died, obviously died from very difficult circumstances around drug and alcohol use. What did Hefner do? He bought all the plots around her burial place because he wanted to be sure he could be buried right next to her. Which was just brutal, because you could make a good argument that some of the things that he did drove her down the path she was going down, and what enabled him to do these things were, quite frankly, what feminists had really done a great job driving, which put men in this position where they basically got everything they wanted, and the funny thing is, when you think about all of the laws that were passed that enabled this, enabled these things to occur, who do you think were passing these laws? It was men. Okay, our Congress, our Senate, it was all men. So it's very interesting what happened here, in the name of feminism, in the name of stopping, or curbing corruption, in the event of curbing violence around the world. You actually create an environment that allowed men to put changes into place, which gave them exactly what men had always wanted. Okay, and no one seemed to notice. Okay, and that is what has happened. The losers were obviously women. Okay, who were even more objectified than ever. Okay, as a matter of fact, I would say objectification, which was not a big issue in the feminist movement. There was never this big cry for let's reduce objectification because it was never that big of a deal. Okay, there was always a great deal of respect. Now there was, pigeonholing of women, there was discrimination of women, certainly, but the objectification was not as widespread as it is today. So what ended up happening is we introduced a new problem, and trying to fix other problems that may not have been terrible problems at all. We've introduced a very new problem, which has actually taken away quite a bit of human dignity from women in today's society. So women are objectified, they're less supported, they're more easily used and abandoned than they ever were in the history of our country, and certainly in Western civilization. Children certainly were losers. They're now killed, killed and denied the optimal environment for maturation, which is the two-parent household. And then families have moved. The nuclear family has moved from being the goal to being the thing you want to avoid. So you no longer strive to build your family; you strive to avoid being burdened with a family. So again, the three big drivers, winners end up being men. Although we're going to talk about how men lose out of this ultimately as well, and losers certainly women, children, and families in general. And that brings us to Pope St. John Paul VI and Humana Vitae. So, back in the early part of the Vatican Council, when Pope John the 23rd was still with us, he put together a commission that was going to study the morality of artificial contraception. And this commission spent, 6 to 7 years with this study. And the commission was a combination of theologians, lay people, a couple of bishops, and they really dug through the science, dug through the social science as well as the physical science, and came up with a recommendation that ultimately went to Paul VI, that yes, contraception should be allowed under certain circumstances within the framework of marriage. All right. Well, clearly that would be a massive change in Catholic teaching, and Paul VI was not going to accept that. He didn't. He took their findings, and what he did instead was write Humana Vitae, which laid out the argument against the use of artificial contraception under any circumstance. Huge backlash in the church. Okay, so he reiterated that perpetual church teaching. Unacceptable. In fact, he actually coined the term that John Paul II ended up using quite a bit throughout his theology of the body. He talked about the gift that was the marital union. So, he coins that, and really basically lays out what is a reasonable and logical framework for why we need to continue to support the Catholic teaching and why it should be embraced. And what ends up happening was you have theologians, clergy, all the way up to bishops and cardinals rejecting Humana Vitae. And what helped them do that was the commission, once they saw Humana Vitae, actually leaked their recommendation to the public. They wanted everyone to know that they recommended something completely different. So very underhanded, and it turned the world in many ways against Paul VI. And this was, a good 9 years, 10 years. I'm trying to think, when did John Paul II, 1979? Yeah, so actually 11 years. A good 11 years before the end of his pontificate, this document is written and released. It's the last thing he ever wrote and released as the Pope. The pushback was so intense, especially, from within the church. Priests were leaving the church. Religious sisters and brothers were leaving their orders. It was sort of like the final straw that just said, "Look, we're in a bad state." The church was labeled as backwards, anti-woman, anti-family, and anti-sex. Okay, and that's a label that's stuck with the Catholic Church throughout the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. It started to reverse course a little bit in the 2000s. But again, this was, through my formative years, if you had asked me, give me some descriptions of the church, I probably would have used all four of these terms, okay? Because it was that was it. That was the common perception. And a lot of it came out of Humana Vitae and the pushback from the so-called experts in the world. But yet, as you read Humana Vitae, one of the beautiful things is it's quite prophetic, okay? Paul VI warned of 4 very distinct outcomes. So he said, look, we're going to open the way for marital infidelity, which we have, okay? And we're going to see a general lowering of moral standards. So those are the first 2 outcomes. And there's no way anyone who has a half a brain in their head could argue we haven't seen a lowering of moral standards. As a matter of fact, you may say we've now seen a complete dismantling of moral standards. So at least sexual moral standards. So again, he's like, if we went forward with contraception, and at this point he has no idea about the second step, which would be legalization of the murder of children in the womb. But at least from a contraceptive perspective, he goes, this becomes widely used. This is a widespread technology that gets put in place, which of course it did. We're going to have at least these first 2 problems, but there's going to be a third problem. Okay, the reverence that are due to women, which had really always been there, okay, is going to be destroyed. Okay, and that's going to mess up the complementarity and equilibrium between men and women. And men are going to begin looking at women as a mere instrument for satisfaction, an object, and that's exactly what has happened. Okay, we have now trained several generations of men to view women as a thing to be purchased and used and changed at will, as opposed to a beloved daughter of God who could be a partner in life. We have very much changed that view, and it's very difficult to change it again. And then, his last outcome is one that a lot of people say, well, this didn't really happen, yet, it has. And this is the danger now of, once you actually go down this path of governments attempting to regulate sexual activity. And, they're like, well, China's different. China and their one-child policy, that's an aberration in a backward society. But, it's actually not that big of an aberration. If you look at even the things that we did here in the United States to push contraception in third world countries, to try to limit childbirth in the name of raising the living standard for people in these developing nations, which, by the way, we now realize has undermined these developing nations, which never built the workforce they needed to drive an industrial economy. Okay, so we were telling them, hey, you need to do this so that you can be economically viable, and what we actually were doing was taking away their pathway to economic viability. Right. Luckily, not all these countries listened to us right away, and you have some of them that were able to then grow their population to the point where they could be economically viable, and you can use India as an example for that. So he predicted 4 things would happen, and all 4 of them have. And again, when he wrote these, people just laughed at him. They said, this is crazy. You're going to an extreme. This is never going to get to the state that you think. This is just a small step in the direction of freedom and common sense. It's not this wild step and slippery slope that you projected. And again, of course it was. And understandably, he was very reluctant for the last decade of his papacy to speak out boldly again, because it had worked, so poorly for him with Humana Vitae. And I love this quote. This is from a very depressing book by a very usually upbeat author named Christian Smith. Why Religion Went Obsolete is the name of the book, if you really want to get a depressing read. But I think he lays it out pretty good in this quote. The world by the 2000s was no longer debating the morality of sex before marriage, but exploring porn websites, friends with benefits, ethical non-monogamy, webcam sex, polyamory, F-buddies, D-pics, sexting, sugar baby, sugar daddy relationships, lugs, which if you don't know is lesbian until graduation, movements, Girls Gone Wild, BDSM, which is bondage and discipline, dominance and submission, sadism and masochism, and the disowning of shame over masturbation, fetishes, and serial hookups. So he's right. Okay, by the time we got to the 2000s, everything was okay. And certain elements of these things actually became championed, and and became not just norms, but became things to strive for. So quite a difference from that late 1950s, early 60s, which clearly was not great either. Okay, but the pendulum swing to the other side went well beyond the conservatism we saw there, the unnecessary conservatism we saw back then, to a point in time where we now have to question whether we can draw any of this back, or draw it back substantially enough in the near term anyway to make a significant difference. So let's talk about the impact on women, men, and families. And this image on the screen kind of tells you everything you need to know. This is the cover of Cosmopolitan magazine. Clearly a magazine designed for women. Okay, this is women are their audience. Not too many men are buying Cosmo. All right, and let's look at this cover. Here you have, certainly a very famous actress, right, Cameron Diaz, in a very provocative outfit and position. All right. Strange that women would want to see Cameron Diaz like this on the cover of the magazine. And let's see some of what they're pumping up in the magazine for this issue. 78 ways to turn him on, what men most want at 9 p.m., sexy summer hair, the weird trait guys look for in a date, 4 fab new vibrators. This is what's on the cover as the big stories in this magazine. So again, a magazine for women, and it's primarily directed on how you can please men. Okay, teaching women how to please men. So for those of you that are wondering, have women been objectified? Yes, they have, and they're objectifying themselves. So first off, women are now primarily responsible and held accountable for all sexual safety nets. So we've pretty much freed men of any responsibility or accountability whatsoever. So exactly what men have always wanted, they have now gotten. Women are subjected to a myriad of contraceptive side effects that we're only now starting to understand after the widespread prescription of the birth control pill for a whole variety of things that studies have shown it does not actually help. Okay. But now we've so widely put them into use that we're starting to realize we've done some long-term damage to women's bodies, and we're now starting to do damage on the genetic levels for both women and men, because there's so much of this stuff in the water systems that we have that you can actually find it in wildlife. So again, a series of unanticipated contraceptive side effects. Again, we're more objectified, or women are more objectified by both men and themselves today than they ever were. Okay, so you were looking for sexual equality, and what you got was a undermining of respect and the dignity of women, to the point that you have a women's magazine which is actually promoting that objectification. Body issues abound, okay, because we're in a sexual competition, right? So body issues and the mental impacts that has, especially on young women, it's really a disaster today, okay? This is an epidemic proportion problem that we've created around body image, specifically for young women. Young women have become, and all women, quite frankly, victims of sexual expectation. If you're not engaged in what the 60s would have called the free love moment, but today it's called the hookup culture, then what's wrong with you? Okay. So we've gone completely the opposite direction, where, someone was villainized for engaging in sexual activity in the 50s and early 60s. And yet today you're actually the villain if you're not. Okay. So didn't take long to flip that coin. Relationship satisfaction has decreased dramatically for women. There's been countless studies, all right, that tell us that, especially the hookup culture of the early 2000s, when that erupted, totally undermined sexual intimacy, which is not important for men. So men aren't affected by this, actually. But as it turns out, it's very important for women. Regardless of what they say, yes or no, every study done is going to point to the majority of women actually craving sexual intimacy, and intimacy you can no longer have in today's, sexually rich culture. Sexual violence is on the rise. You're almost 3 times more likely to be the victim of sexual violence today than you were in 1955, which is just insane. Sexual commoditization, obviously on the rise with that. So whether it be prostitution and or sexual trafficking, also often very related together. Much more prolific today than it ever has been. So, one of the arguments, strangely enough, back in the late 50s and early 60s for greater sexual freedom was that it would actually be a deterrent to prostitution and sexual trafficking, which obviously were, two very negative impacting elements of our society for women. And yet what it has actually done is increase both. So, you intended one thing out of the sexual revolution, and what we ended up having was a whole myriad of unexpected consequences. And with a couple of rare exceptions, most of the goals never actually were realized. The negatives so far outweigh the positives, specifically for women and children, that it's actually hard to believe that anyone once thought those positives would be realized. But again, hindsight's always 20/20. So I'm not putting the blame on these women that were driving the movement back then. But certainly I can put that, they have to be able to shoulder some of that blame today, where they have that hindsight and can start to realize, hey, we got to fix this. And I'm very anxiously waiting for that fix to begin. So let's look at the impact of men. I love this image on the back of the screen because these are men, okay? And most people are like, well, these are boys. And I said, well, these are guys all in their mid-20s hanging out, doing nothing, all right? And again, they've been trained to do nothing, okay? First off, they said, look, sexual adventure is really just a screen scroll away So, that's no longer something I have to work for. It's pretty easy. And by the way, I have no responsibility in the act anyway. It's really the woman's issue. She's got to bring everything to the table to take that responsibility. I'm not going to be accountable, don't need to be, and it's no longer something I worry about. Which has turned into, an incentive for material success, financial success, and independence has kind of gone away. I mean, back in my day growing up, if you hadn't, achieved some level of financial independence and were on a career track of some sort, and were out on your own living independently, the likelihood of you having a girlfriend was pretty slim. So that enough was an incentive to get off the couch and start doing stuff. But that's no longer an issue, and we're actually starting to see that play out where, especially when we talk about colleges, that we reached an inflection point in college admissions in the last 5 to 6 years where there are more women being admitted to universities in the United States than men, colleges and universities. And strangely enough, 2 years ago, it started to accelerate to the point where the study that came out in 2025 actually pointed out that at this point in United States colleges and universities, 63%, I believe, of the enrollees are actually female now. So we actually have almost a 2-to-1 ratio female to male in colleges and universities. And people are starting to realize, wow, what happened to the guys? How come they're not pursuing higher education? And, it's because they're still pursuing the latest video game sitting on the couch here. They really have no incentive to move forward. And in some cases, people say no hope either, but, really got a problem. So, men also then got trained, sex is purely for pleasure. And this has resulted in an interesting dichotomy for men. So, it used to be you were seeking a girlfriend that could be your wife. And now men actually make a clear distinction between someone who could be a girlfriend and someone who could be their wife. So this has really been a trend that's been heightened in the last 2 decades, and especially the last decade since, the 2010s and on, where men now make a very significant breaking point where they said, yeah, these are girls I want to date. And this is the type of girl I'd want to marry. And there is no relationship between them at all. So this has become a huge problem, which is added to the delay in marriage and added to the reduction in number of people who are getting married. And certainly from a female perspective, they'll talk about the lack of actually suitable partners or marriageable men out there on the market today. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But this is combined with the rise in fatherless boys. So the single parent household has a dramatic impact on the financial and emotional health of men. So this is one area where there's a lesser impact on women, but a huge impact on men. So these boys who are being brought up in single parent households are not getting what they need to actually mature to the point where they can be the head of a household themselves. And hence they're just simply not growing up, right? Which again relates to that decline in marriageable men. Right. Men, the latest study is of 20 to 30-year-old women is that they actually perceive that less than 20% of all men in their age group are marriageable. All right. So their perception of eligible men is very dim. All right. And again, that's because you have men being increasingly financially and emotionally stifled. Porn addictions have both psychologically damaged men and now have a physiological impact. So we have more men in their 20s and 30s with erectile dysfunction than we have men in their 50s and 60s. It was unheard of 20 years ago to have a man below the age of 50 have erectile dysfunction. Today, it's commonplace, and it's commonplace because we're having men that are losing the ability to be aroused by actual human beings. They can only be aroused in a 2-dimensional space. So this is a huge problem, okay? And again, this increased violence that they see in that two-dimensional space has altered male views on sex, which has made men much more violent during their sexual encounters, and really has had an effect, a secondary effect on women who are now becoming increasingly afraid of sex. Hence the lug movement, lesbian until graduation. Part of the drivers of that movement in American colleges and universities, besides the fact that there are so few men on campus, is that it's safe. Okay, it's perceived as a much safer route for your college years when you have these very unstable and potentially violent men who want to engage in sexual behaviors that really, up until just a decade or two ago, could have been criminalized. So again, men do lose. Okay, so even though men were the big winners of the sexual revolution, they may end up also being the biggest losers of the sexual revolution, because the long-term impact on maleness, okay, and the ability to grow and become the men that women want men to be, it's starting to get to a devastating level of negative impact. And of course, the family has suffered. We have delayed adulthood. Adolescence now lasts until you're 25, means the number of opportunities to actually have children, or the amount of time that you're in childbearing years, has been reduced quite a bit. If you do form a family, the result of that is fewer children are born. Again, that marriage rate decline and divorce rates in the 40 to 50% range has magnified that birth rate decline. Single parent families continue to rise, which is meaning that we're not developing children fully. It's not that single parent families can't do amazing things, and I've seen many that have, but as a general view, it is not optimal, okay? And more often than not results in a negative outcome. So again, this is problematic. The nuclear family, no longer the dominant family model. So in 1970, 40% of all US households were nuclear families. So 40%, 4 out of 10 houses. Today, it's 18%. So less than 2 out of 10, okay? So a dramatic decrease in really a relatively short period of time, a half a century. So the nuclear family has fallen out of favor and is now a minority in the space of household categorization. Again, these diverse family environments are normalizing, right? Despite the fact that all the data tells us that it's not actually good for the family, okay? So, 2 dads, 2 moms, not good, okay? 1 dad, 1 mom with no partner, not good, all right? Multiple different siblings from different marriages being raised together, not good. Okay, all the data will tell you that all of these things will generally contribute to poor performance, both on the mental, physical, and actually financial security levels. So huge problems for families, and the result of this is no child left behind, which was the big mantra of the 80s and 90s, has just been replaced with no child. Okay, let's not have them. It's too hard to raise them now. There's too many negative things that can happen to them. We don't have time for them. Whatever it happens to be, let's forgo children. Well, the result of that is we are now facing a worldwide population decline. Okay, and it's irreversible at this point. So we already have over 100 countries that are in actual population decline. And, over the next decade or so, perhaps 2 decades, the world itself as an entirety will be in population decline. This is why China is no longer the world's most populous country. It was for so long, but it is in significant population decline, and India has now passed it for the mantle of the world's most populous country. So again, population decline is underway. Large number of countries already in it. And in fact, our country, United States, would be in population decline, except for the fact that we have a high degree of immigration into the country. So our net immigration benefit is the only reason we're not in population decline. But that will soon change. Again, the worldwide workforce, it's no longer big enough to sustain our aging society. Okay, huge struggle in the oldest countries, whether it be Korea or Italy or Japan. Now we're talking France is falling into this realm. You have countries where, you know, the number of older people that the country needs to figure out how to support can no longer be supported by the youth in the workforce. So there's not enough youth in the workforce. Obviously, a huge economic impact. Because these aging countries, the aging societies, they just cost more to maintain, clearly, okay? It's, you know, medical expenses, health expenses rise dramatically past age 70. And, you know, with fewer inputs into the taxation systems, you know, the government-sponsored support systems are going to start collapsing upon themselves. And we already see that happening in so many countries, especially those countries that had, you know, for generations been promoting their government-supported healthcare systems. Cutbacks in the support of those systems has, you know, now rising to a level where those systems are no longer capable of providing an adequate standard of care. So we actually have these problems across the world. Again, the more of that aging population also happens to be childless. So now we have the people that grew up in the 60s and 70s actually in their 60s and 70s. And what that means is, you know, this whole idea of, you know, no children is good. One children is acceptable, or one child is acceptable, two would be your limit. Well, the result is we've lost all sense of familial support for the aging population. You know, so parents obviously who had no children have no children to help them in their elder years, and parents that did have one or two children may not even have them anymore. They may have preceded them, or if they did, they're likely on another piece of the country and not able to provide them some of the support that has traditionally been there for children, for their parents in their waning years. Men with little drive to succeed and take responsibility are going to have to be increasingly carried by women, okay, which is going to further reduce women's ability to procreate, which will further reduce the number of children that we have, which will further reduce the number of people entering our workforce, which means we have an economic failure. Again, without those traditional family structures in place, the ability to produce productive members of society, male or female, decreases. So we have you know, even those members of society we are producing are not necessarily adding to the economic advantage, but in many cases becoming a drain on the economies of the countries in which they live. Which is why the next resource war won't be fought over land. It won't be fought over minerals. It's not going to be fought over whatever natural resource a country has. The next wave of wars are going to be fought over workers, over bodies. We're going to be fighting to bring people into our country that can support our economy and staff our workforce. So we could be going back to the days of, you know, King David and King Solomon, when they would ride out each spring to go conquer a neighboring country and bring back workers for their economy. We could be going down that path, and it's more likely than it's not. So, you know, getting back to the original question, did the sexual revolution objectify women, turn men into boys, and undermine our economy? Well, yeah. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to say no. And again, none of this were intended consequences, and it isn't just, you know, the later waves of feminism that drove it. There were a lot of things that happened at the same time that collated to actually produce the situation we're in today. But the reality is that we now objectify women more than ever. We have a real problem with the maturation of young men, or boys into young men into mature contributors in society. And the reality is, with the massive loss of children, whether it be by killing them directly or simply not having them, is really put us in a position where our economies are no longer sustainable, which will eliminate the government safety nets, which are there to support the elderly, and the elderly have no children to help make up the difference. So, it will not be long before we start hearing those cries. It's time to start killing the old people, because they're actually causing such a drain on our society. So that is the next logical step. So with that, again, we're doing it live. We go through a lot of questions. I can tell you there was quite a bit of debate and questions at the end of this talk. A lot of it, following on from the great talk on the theology of the body, which then drove into this, and all the various historical and conditions that had to be in place in order for the sexual revolution to thrive, and do the damage that it has done. So a lot of questions. If you have questions, feel free to send them to me. I'd be glad to answer them. But with this, I'm just going to end in prayer and call it a day. So join me if you would. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, thank you so much for being able to explore this topic. If we don't start talking about it honestly and openly, we can't fix it. But by giving us the grace we need to dig in, and giving us the reason that you blessed us with to understand, hopefully we can now start to address this problem, and within a generation or two start to turn it around and learn from our mistakes. And we just ask for the grace to do that, and the grace to come back to you and recognize that your teachings have been right all along, and they are what is the best for our eternal good. And we ask this in your holy name, in the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen.